Finally, and this is, I think, in many ways the most powerful, we've got to be willing to question the status quo. The structural issue raised by the McAllister president is about far more than just simplifying the organization chart. It lies at the heart of how well we do our job as educators and scholars. Because the questions that we face today as a society that have become most critical necessarily call for multidisciplinary responses. And there are precious few that align cleanly with traditional colleges and departments. Consider the pandemic, calling on the expertise and experience of scholars in public health, in medicine, in pharmaceuticals, economics, mass communication, history, chemistry, business administration, and yes, philosophy. We know this, and we've responded with problem-based learning and competency-based education and curricular form that aligns general education with the majors to the benefit of both. We've combined short-term, non-degree credentials, such as certificates and certifications, in hybrid degrees that enable our students to become more competitive. And we should celebrate that work that is more about our students than about my discipline. But in far too many colleges and universities, academic structure and curricula remain an arrangement of disciplinary silos that discourage collaboration across the curriculum and across the campus. We've learned a lot over the last 14 months, to be sure. We've learned that distance education, preferably in combination with in-person learning, can sometimes work better than either can by itself. Fresh advantages to our students can result. The efficiencies we found in working from home can encourage innovative space management on our campuses, perhaps reduce the necessity for daily commuting. And our academic organizations have learned that our physical presence at professional meetings, however preferable, is not essential to a productive exchange of ideas. Finally, I think higher education has to take a lead role in questioning a lack of respect for non-academic talent and creativity. A new book by Michael Sandel, titled The Tyranny of Merit, offers a compelling case. His thesis in a nutshell is that elites have so valorized a college degree that they have difficulty understanding the hubris a meritocracy can generate and the harsh judgment it imposes on those who have not gone to college. And as we've seen all too recently, that harsh judgment can inspire resentment. And that resentment can express itself through a contempt for expertise, a preference for opinion over evidence, a susceptibility to misinformation, and a resort to violence. Colleges and universities can address this challenge. We can make it clear the respect that we feel for those who have pursued vocational excellence outside of the academy, those who complete apprenticeship programs, those who find success as craftspeople, those who take non-traditional routes to becoming artists or CEOs. And we can remember that on a cold winter's morning, there may be no member of a college staff more important than the licensed plumber. We can also double down on enabling our students to appreciate the importance of critical, evidence-based thinking, giving our students more compelling practical experience in ethical reasoning, and helping them develop their capacity to weigh competing opinions in the light of reliable evidence. And we can teach by example, modeling rational thought and decision-making through how we teach and how we lead. So I've given some suggestions of my own. This is your opportunity. if we are to increase the appreciation for higher education as a public good, are any of these opportunities that I've mentioned, do they seem to you to be promising? And even more important, can you give us some other ideas in terms of how we might proceed?
I think one of the elements that is a challenge, not just to universities, it actually begins at K through 12. I think there is a suspicion by many people that as we hear about the lack, or the fact that our kids are getting out of school and they're not really prepared for college, I think that carries over to universities, and we need to address that part of it, that people really respect what's being done at K through 12 and feel like they're getting their money's worth there, and then will feel much more confident that the universities are going to be able to continue that mission.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is at the heart of quality assurance. Have we made clear what it is that we are accomplishing for students, and can we demonstrate they are accomplishing that? And the other line of argument we're getting is from employers who are saying we're hiring people with college degrees, they're not educated as fully as we would prefer.
Right, and I think you touched on something else that's very important that I've seen, and I'm an attorney, in my clients. Many of them have said they can't get skilled tradespeople, tool and die people, electricians, plumbers, designers. So there is, I think, there was a sense, and maybe we're coming away from that everybody had to go to college. And it became sort of a commodity. And I think we lost respect for those tradespeople that are really fundamental to so many industries. So I think that has to be built into a recognition of the value of higher education. And then the third thing I'll point to is there is a thought process out there, a philosophy that college has to prepare you for some profession. And I think that runs counter to the idea of a liberal education. Not just what you learn, but what you become. And I think we have to do a better job of cultivating that sense of the maturing process and the ability to gain wisdom and to think critically. That all those are also skills, not just, I can become an accountant or I can do something like that. But I think we have to build that into our educational process also.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful perspective. The third element that I would add is the one that Carol Schneider has so often said about a liberal education, former president of Association of American Colleges and Universities. She says that a liberal education must also be the most practical education. It must be the most job-oriented preparation because of the very elements that you mentioned, because of the liberalizing effect, because the adaptability it brings, the love of learning, all of those things. So you've broadened this discussion, for which I thank you. Well, I think I'll move on to my final word because I want to make sure that the commentators have sufficient time to register their perspectives. The first observation I would make is that all of these issues are now more compelling, more conspicuous as a result of the pandemic. But perhaps they can be more readily accomplished if we will hold in our hands and in our committee meetings the sense of what we've learned through this difficult process. Then I think that we may have some opportunity of achieving some momentum. Lynn Pasquarella, president now of
AAC&U brings a capstone to my address that I want to share with you. The ideal of higher education as a public good, once inextricably linked to the American dream, has been all but abandoned in favor of the college degree as a private commodity. The narrow focus on earning power, coinciding with demographic shifts in the number and diversity of college students, has fueled the understanding of college as a purely private benefit rather than a good for all. Our colleges should instead be seen as a means of strengthening our democracy, as well as bolstering our nation's economy. We can make this a pivotal and productive time for higher education. The opportunity we have before us for higher education to consider how it serves students and to look for ways to serve them more effectively and efficiently. If we take that challenge seriously and can be seen to do so, we may be able to rekindle the public appreciation for the work that we and our students do. If we were able to do that, we would be in a position to offer leadership to the nation in reclaiming one of its proudest legacies and most distinctive values. And colleges and universities could become, once again, a treasured source of the public happiness. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gaston. Appreciate it. I think I'm going to take just a second and have everybody shake their arms out a little bit. I think we've had some excitement tonight. I think we've had some, right? Like, so everybody just take a second, take a deep breath, and let's move on with our evening. Paul shared a quote with us from President Lyndon B. Johnson. For the individual, education is the path to achievement and fulfillment. For the nation, it is a path to a society that is not only free, but civilized. And for the world, it is the path to peace, for it is education that places reason over force. In my discussion this evening, I want us to re-examine the question that this quote presupposes. What is the purpose of education? And so throughout the evening, I'd like you to be thinking, what is the purpose of education as we go through some of these ideas? This is a question that I ask my students on a regular basis because, you see, I train teachers on how to teach. My children think that's hysterically funny, right? Teach the teachers how to teach. But before we can think about strategies, before we can think about assessments, before we can think about standards and accountability, we really need to think about why we educate. The how is structured around the why, and without the why, there is a struggle to maintain how, who, where, and when. Interestingly, in this year of the pandemic, I received my first answers other than a good job. This was the first time in 9 years asking this question that I received answers like, think critically, build community, help ourselves and others. I find it interesting that that moment of pause in our lives allowed them to find a different answer. I believe that what has been shared tonight is all correct. That we need more stories from the world of higher education to better understand its public interest. That we need more stories from our students, our staff, our faculty, and those stakeholders who benefit from our successes. That we need to refocus as a society on the both and possibilities rather than the either or that our culture so readily reaches for. Academic and non-academic talent are important. Quality and equity need to be centered. That both individual good and communal well-being can come from a university education. We need to shift to this both and thinking for the sake of both our students and the communities of the future that they will lead. I think one of the assumptions missed or at least one of the underlying assumptions that no one likes to discuss, however, is the idea of the common good, of community and belonging as important to the individual. Education, particularly higher education, has been complicit in the forgetting of the both-and idea when it comes to community and the individual, and instead focuses centrally on the individual. But I would also argue that this didn't happen in the 70s through policy and culture shifts. Instead, I believe that it has been woven into the very essence of education in the United States, and that it will take both a communal cultural shift and individual efforts to uncover the missing strands of community and rebraid them into the fabric of our society. And I both believe higher education and each of us has a role to play in this work. So you'll have to forgive me, I'm a cultural studies professor, so I have to give a little context. That's kind of what I do, so bear with me as I give some context here. In previous bygone eras of time, we educated to pass along cultural knowledge, ways of knowing, doing, and being that allowed us to survive, thrive, in our albeit smaller and more homogeneous communities. The academic knowledge to be shared was much different than today, and also much more limited to those who could afford it. There's a suggestion, a viral meme of some sort, that all of the information found in one of today's New York Times newspapers was a lifetime of information in the 18th century. So think about that for a minute, and then ponder again, what is the purpose of education? If we can, in 1 week's newspaper, gain the amount of information that people were learning in 200 years ago, what is the purpose of education? In the 18th century, the collision of social, political, and economic revolutions drove upheavals in society. Monarchies were upended, industrialization exploded, cultural norms expired or were transformed. In the midst of these upheavals, an idealistic nation was born, founded on a recipe of myths, hypocrisies, and grit. All men are created equal, alongside the unpaid labor of slaves, women, and the poor, and on what some consider to be stolen, unfair theft of native lands. Add a little scientific revolutionary thinking, such as the idea of the conservation of energy, and we have a competition for finite resources built into our cultural foundations as well. For some extra spice, let's stir in some Protestant work ethic, rugged individualism, and savior complex, and we have the infrastructure of a new culture, politically, socially, and economically. But again, what's the purpose of education in this new cultural milieu? Which really wasn't new, but rather a reshuffling of old norms onto a different continent. According to Karen Hartnett in Education and the Struggle for Democracy, the role of education in a democracy is to meet the perceived needs of society. And in order to meet those needs, it relies on the ability of certain groups to persuade others to address these needs in certain ways. What rises to the top of my mind, then, are two ideas that have created a story about the perceived needs of the U.S. citizen and how to address those needs. The first is the myth of the American dream, while the second is that education is the great equalizer in this meritocracy. Within that mythos, there is no mention of community or public good. There is instead the foundation that we all have the unalienable individual rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In framing a new world, we forgot to address the both and in the foundation of many of our institutions, but particularly in the education system. American meritocracy was designed to allow for the pursuit of the American dream. How better to establish life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness within a new society than to give them a new dream to reach for? The pursuit of social class mobility was also a way to distance a new nation from rigid social structures from class distinctions, and also as a reward for the hard work of pulling oneself up by their bootstraps, regardless of whether or not you owned boots or had a personal servant or slave to help you put those boots on. But even then, how can we make sure that there was fair competition, equal opportunity, that class position was the result of merit and not birth? How was a new nation to accomplish this? Through education, of course. A common school experience for all children. But we don't, even to this day, actually provide that common experience. Our institutions, including and especially education, weren't actually set up to fulfill the American dream because we made this about individual dreams, individual successes, and individual opportunities. We forgot the community. We allowed certain people to opt out of that community and out of the common schooling education, and barred others from entering. But I think that also makes us question, what is a community? And how can higher education help us claim or reclaim those spaces of connection? So according to Igor Jasinski and Tyson Lewis, community is, quote unquote, one of those words that brings to mind what Augustine says about time. We know what it means, or at least what we mean by it, unless somebody asks us. For me, as a former biology teacher, I prefer ecological definitions of community, right? I see things as a web of connections. So as you look around the room tonight, think about how you are connected to everyone else in this space. Or think about your family and friends. Picture that spider web of connections. Can everybody see it? I'm sure you've maybe played a school game where you tossed the string around and everybody was connected to everyone else. But to me, a flat, one-dimensional web does not do justice to the depth of connectivities that I visualize in a community. How many of you remember the game Cat's Cradle? Does anybody remember the game Cat's Cradle? Oh, good, I'm so glad. Look, I even brought, right, the teacher in me brought like something to demonstrate with. Does everybody remember this game, right? Okay. So Donna Haraway is a professor of the history of consciousness. How much fun would that be? Just as a title, History of Consciousness. And she uses the imagery of the child's game, the Cat's Cradle, to explain the constantly changing relationships between multiple ideas. I like the imagery that this implies, but I would like us to use it to think a little bit further than just ideas. Not only is Cat's Cradle a game that requires many hands, I can't get any farther in the game than I just did with only my own two hands, right? But it has depth and dimensionality, unlike the visual of a flat spider web. And it grows more complex over time. In a society that I would argue has a binary bias, that either-or thinking, I believe we need to complexify, add content, add layers, think through a both-and lens. When we imagine community in this way, we see much more holistically our connections to others, humans, the earth, culture, history, and we realize that community and connection is the key to the entire game, and that it cannot be either-or because we are connected to everything and everyone in constantly changing contexts. Those holding the strings during this game are constantly changing and influencing the patterns that develop, creating messier and more complex connections of strings, knots, and spaces. Some people and beings simply hold the string, exerting no influence or very little influence on the changing of patterns, but are still implicated in the webs of connection and the eventual patterns that they help create. While still others manipulate the strings directly, attempting to change the outcome on their own. Beyond human beings, non-human and non-living entities are part of that web as well, just as intricately woven into the fabric of community as humans, influencing patterns and connections as much as, if not more than, their human counterparts. If I use this imagery to understand relationships and the creation of community, I cannot disconnect context, history, and culture from each other. If I develop this imagery just a little bit further, this four-dimensional game puts everything within a context, whether historically, culturally, or ecologically, because the connections and the communities never end. They are constantly going and growing forwards, backwards, and all around. And only by exploring the relationships between the nodes, between the knots, can an understanding begin to develop of how differences and similarities affect, create, and sustain our community. And I don't think this community is hidden, but I do think we often focus on the knots and the nodes rather than the whole. We forget the forest for the trees. Colleges and universities are uniquely situated to help us uncover and grow this community in much more intentional ways. It is already there on our campuses and in our missions. Thomas More's mission, in part, seeks to help students find their place in the world and their responsibilities to others. We recognize in that mission that students have both an individual right to find where they belong and a responsibility to that space, to that community, to that belonging. And if students have both rights and responsibilities, then we, faculty, staff, stakeholders, also have rights and responsibilities to the self and to the community. From the university community as a whole, to its relationship with the local, national, and global community, all the way to the smaller communities in a residence hall or even in a classroom. The cat's cradle idea of nodes, knots, strings, and connections can help us shift from awareness to belonging, from either individual good or community good to both individual and community good. Adam Grant, in his book Think Again, states, "It takes confident humility to admit that we're a work in progress. It shows we care more about improving ourselves than proving ourselves." If we can think about this process of community as improving ourselves, if we can discuss our individual connections and our relationships with each other and the broader community, if we look for both the spaces and the strings rather than only the nodes and the knots in a never-ending cat's cradle progression, we can turn our energy towards understanding that striving for the American dream is far more reachable when the community is strong. It is through this both and perspective that we see possibilities for reaching President Johnson's desire for the individual, the nation, and the world. And I will leave you with this quote that is attributed to Pope Francis. "No one saves oneself. The community is what is essential." Thank you. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Dr. Deborah Humphries, who is not with us today, but is joining us via Zoom. So give us a moment and we'll pull Dr. Humphries up.
Okay, thanks so much. So it's a great privilege to be here tonight and to be able to share with you some comments. And I want to frame my reaction comments more as a sort of supplement than as a rejoinder to Paul's kind of excellent tour through America's higher education legacy and our contemporary challenges. So I want to join his call to action as well on the part of those of us in higher education to really renew our sector's mission of reclaiming the public happiness. And I believe that Paul has posed many of the right questions about this topic and has given us a really valuable historical framework for thinking about these challenges. So I really want to just add two main ideas, or really amplifications, in reaction to Paul's analysis, accompanied by my own call to action related to those ideas. And I'm really pleased to be able to have followed Dr. Tim Haverkas, because you'll see some themes that are a bit common, and which is interesting because we didn't actually plan this. So I really share Paul's view that we're in a critical moment in the history of higher education. We face serious threats, and we actually have alarming levels of declining public confidence. I also agree that our response to this challenge really needs to be less defensive and more proactive, but also humble. So like Paul, I'm actually quite confident that our sector can, at its best, be a vehicle to advance public happiness and the public good. However, I do think we need to reposition higher education for our current moment. And just to add to the many ideas that Paul has provided, I really believe that a constructive reposition must begin with very clear-eyed recognition of our history and of our current reality, particularly concerning a theme that's been mentioned both by Paul and by Kim, and that is equity, and particularly racial equity. So second, I want to suggest that to effect this reposition, I want to suggest something that might be a little bit counterintuitive. Rather than us focusing exclusively on higher education's internal issues alone, I think we should be relying also more heavily on our peripheral vision and pay far more attention to other sectors with whom we can and should be partnering. So this is very reflective of the theme of community that Kim mentioned earlier. So first, a word about higher education and racial equity. And we all know that this history is, of course, complicated. Nothing close to a straight line, leading to greater, more equitable access and success for students of color. Instead, like all institutions in America, colleges and universities have actually often been agents of inequity. And as uncomfortable as it may be to admit, higher education itself has been profoundly unfair and damaging in its preservation of privilege, and often white and male privilege. Now, Paul rightly points out very key moments in our history of expanded access. And overall, we can point to significant increases in the numbers of Black, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American students in higher education. And the progress on women's achievement is particularly notable and very positive. Still, the disparities in college degree attainment remain striking, both by race and by socioeconomic background. In 2019, more than 48% of white Americans had either a 2-year or a 4-year college degree. That compares to only 32.4% of Black Americans and around 25% of Hispanic Americans and Native Americans. Now, Paul also pointed out the disparities in access to our most selective colleges and universities by income. And unfortunately, to widen your aperture, that gap actually extends across our entire system of higher education. We find that low-achieving high school graduates from high-income families are actually attending college at the same rate as our high-achieving low-income. So we're very far from actually having the meritocracy that we really would like to believe that we are made. So I say all this not to undermine the significant progress we've made, both in increased access and also by offering a richer, more engaging education to today's student. I think these are developments of which we can actually be very proud. Still, we have to face the fact that we remain part of a deeply unfair system, even as we also are one avenue to help make our society more fair, more just, and more democratic. So, as challenging as that is, I think we have to actually hold these two realities in our minds and in our narratives about higher education at the same time. And I want to quote an interesting author, Ilioma Oluo, who in her recent book, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, said the following. She It is a broken system that can do a lot of harm to marginalized people. Yet, it's the best place in America for our young people to formulate their social and political consciousness. So there's much to do to address inequity in our society and in higher education. But one essential place to start is, of course, with our own history, as Paul actually reminds us. And there's some really notable examples out there. Some institutions, Brown University, Georgetown University, for instance, have for a number of years worked very hard to reckon with, and in some cases make amends for their own roles in the nation's legacy of racial inequality and violence. And I'll add just one other example of a historical perspective we need to see very clearly in order to move forward. So Paul rightly referenced the GI Bill in 1944 as a key moment of progress in expanding the American vision of widely accessible higher education. And I certainly believe that the GI Bill had a huge and positive impact on our sector and on our society. But it's important to remember that, one, many organizations representing higher institutions, including one where I used to work, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, which Paul referenced as well, actually had great misgivings about the GI Bill. Officials and board members worried that returning veterans would overwhelm institutions, would harm the educational environment, would threaten the tradition of liberal education, and it might result in a lowering of standards. More disturbingly, the bill actually didn't wind up helping Black veterans very much at all. Very few Black veterans were able to take advantage of the bill's educational benefits or its housing benefits either, given the tradition of redlining and other aspects of structural racism at the time. Many Northern selected institutions simply didn't accept Black applicants. Many in the South barred them completely. And according to the history, the VA itself actively encouraged Black veterans to apply for vocational training instead of university admission, and sometimes simply arbitrarily denied these benefits to Black veterans. So this is just one example of how stubbornly our nation's history of white privilege has endured, even as we have tried to expand the equality of opportunity. So we have to face this reality if we are going to effectively reposition higher education as a force for the public good today. And I believe that if we're going to regain the trust of an increasingly diverse nation, we really need to fully reckon with this history. And of course, we have to work harder and much faster to close those gaps in student access and success. Now, in addition to this focus on equity, this project of restoring and repositioning higher education will depend, as Kim mentioned, on our ability to collaborate and to innovate. So Paul noted some of the promising areas of innovation already underway, and they deserve a lot more attention. And I really want to sort of double down on that idea. I strongly believe we need our institutions of higher education to be much more open and to build a robust set of partnerships to fuel innovation and to help rebuild public trust. And our partners really need to represent all different kinds of sectors, both public and private. And like us, they have to be seen as having a stake in this increasing of opportunity, this restoring of democratic values, and this rebuilding of civic institutions. So I believe really strongly, something that was mentioned earlier, that higher ed institutions have to be enthusiastic partners with employers of all sorts. And I would argue that this does not mean at all that we have to sacrifice our commitment to the pursuit of knowledge or abandon our commitment to provide a strong liberal education that prepares students for civic leadership. But we simply must do a better job of designing our degree programs to explicitly and transparently give today's students the full set of skills and capacities they need to succeed in our rapidly changing digital economy. It isn't either or, it is both and, as Kim suggested. We can provide students with the skills and knowledge they need to be successful in work, in life, and as citizens. And in fact, research with employers suggests strongly that many of the skills that are most important for success in today's economy are precisely those that are also essential in this task of rebuilding our democracy. So finally, while we partner with employers, we can't stop there. We must widen our aperture to fully view the various challenges to our democracy and the many actors who are also working on those challenges. I think we have a role to play in higher education, but we cannot and should not pursue this mission on our own in isolation from others. So just one effort I might suggest as a model is our Common Purpose project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It is a multifaceted, ambitious project that, as they state in the introduction to their recently released report, touches all sectors of American life and offers a bold path that will require all of us to commit to reinventing aspects of our constitutional democracy. The report notes further that the realities of a disruptive media and information environment, outdated political institutions, economic and social inequality, and hyper-partisan political leadership have laid bare the urgency of this imperative. So I strongly recommend the report and its recommendations to you, and I think higher ed institutions can play a really critical role in this kind of cross-sector ambitious project. So I want to finish, like others have, and follow Paul's lead, Kim's lead, and remind us again of our history and key moments in our history. And I want to quote Abraham Lincoln in his message to Congress in 1862, which is just about a month before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. And he said the following: "We can succeed only by concert. It is not can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better? The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." Thank you so much for including me tonight.
My name is Dave Schroeder. I am a graduate of Thomas More University, and I learned critical thinking skills and problem solving. So I want to thank Dr. Gaston, Dr. Heatherkos, and Dr. Humphries. Dr. Gaston is going to wrap up the evening tonight with a few final remarks.
And the emphasis is on few, but the emphasis is on gratitude for remarkably coherent and collegial commentaries that have done a great deal, I think, to expand the ever-increasing sharp focus that I was attempting to draw in my paper. Deborah referred to broadening the aperture and referred to the need for us to have a broader sense, a more inclusive sense of community. They both spoke, I thought, quite powerfully of alliances that we need to build on equal terms, that we need to have others working with us, and that we go to them not, we're here from higher education and we're here to help you, but rather we need to work together in order to help our society. And for that broadening of the context, that expansion of our thinking this evening, I'm very grateful, and I'm sure you join me in that gratitude.